So welcome to the Nature of Mind project. My name is Maitreya Bandhu and I'm here in the main shrine room of Adhisthana International Buddhist Centre at Adhisthana in the Herefordshire countryside in the UK. I'm going to be talking to Subhuti. Subhuti was ordained into the Triratna Buddhist order in 1973. So that means that next year he'll have been ordained for 50 years into the Triratna Buddhist order. He's written 9 books on Buddhism, and he's been a major presence, a major teacher in the Triratna Buddhist order for all of that time. So welcome, Subhuti.
Thank you.
Welcome. Really good to have you here on the Nature of Mind project. So in a certain sense, I've only got one question to ask you. This Nature of Mind project, as you know, it's exploring the nature of mind, looking at neuroscience, looking at psychology, looking at all kinds of perspectives on the nature of mind. But of course, we also want to hear what is the Buddhist perspective on the nature of mind, the particularly Buddhist perspective on the nature of mind. Now, Buddhism is a 2,500-year-old tradition, so it doesn't feel quite right to say, yeah, but what does 2,500 years say about the nature of mind? But could you find a way of sort of plunging into saying, well, what is the Buddhist perspective on the nature of mind?
Well, the first thing I can say is to recount to you a story of our teacher, Ogyen Sangharakshita. I remember he was once at a conference of mystics and scientists. It really happened. And in this conference, he was asked the question, what is mind? Because he'd been talking about it. So he turned to the audience and said, why are you asking me? You've got minds. Why are you asking me? Now, this wasn't just good theatre. He was making a point that Buddhism is not concerned with theory. It's not about some metaphysical interpretation of mind or whatever, although theory is there. But what Buddhism is interested in is a direct experience. So anything that it has to say about mind is going to be helping us to look at our own immediate experience. So we're not trying to come up with some theory, some grand schema. So I could start by saying this. The Buddha is famous for what is called his metaphysical reticence, his refusal to say anything that could lead to what Buddhism calls a view, that is a theoretical construct about the nature of things, whether it's mind or anything else. So whatever I can say, I hope that I will be scrupulous to the Buddhist tradition in refusing to allow myself to get led into any speculative or theoretical presentation. And please don't try to trap me.
I might let it go.
When Sangharakshita said, look at your own experience, that's a very serious point. Whatever we've got to say about mind, in the end, we have to be able to check it back with what we can directly see. So when we say a word like mind, it's very fuzzy. It's very difficult to know precisely what it is that we're talking about. And looking at the tradition as a whole, you could say that, especially in its later forms, there are perhaps 3 main target areas that are covered by the word mind. So the first is what is to do with sensing, sense consciousnesses. That is, in Buddhist tradition, the 6 sense consciousnesses, the 5 physical senses, plus the mind as, well, what in medieval Western philosophy was called the common sense. Our word common sense is to do with that sense which organizes the other 5 senses into an integrated experience. You know, because I'm getting information from my sense of touch, from my eyes, from my ears, etc. But what I experience is an integrated whole, and that is, according to Buddhist theory, manovijnana, the mind awareness. So it's the common sense. So all those six senses are the as it were, outer casing of what we mean by mind. And in early Buddhism, that is primarily what's indicated, the six sense awarenesses, which are conceived of as momentary. They are dependently arising. In Buddhism, there's no such thing as mind, if you see what I mean. There's no static, stable, independent, eternal entity. Well, it can't be an entity, can it? But let's just use a precise philosophical term, thing, mind. It's a term for a set of processes which are primarily to do with the perception of, through the five senses, organized by the sixth sense, which has its own independent objects, dreams and visions and even extrasensory perception and so on. So that's the primary content of the word mind from a traditional Buddhist point of view. Later Buddhism began to have a more sophisticated conception of the mind and developed what you might call a depth psychology, which achieved its highest degree of articulation in the Yogacara philosophy. And briefly, that says that there are three, well, they call them transformations of mind, of consciousness more than mind. So the first transformation, going from the outside, so to speak, is those six sense consciousnesses. Then there's what is called the manas, or in later development, the Klishna Mana Vijnana. Manas means thinking, that which thinks. And that is that aspect of mental functioning that abstracts from experience and builds a conceptualized construction of it. And that would include the huge range of what we normally think of as reality. It's time, for instance, is constructed. It's, here Kant confirms what Buddhism's always said, that mind and space are, as it were, time and space are dimensions of awareness within awareness rather than being what contains awareness. So manas is that which constructs our experience in terms of time and in terms especially of a self, a stable, fixed, eternal observer, agent of action and experiencer, and a stable, fixed, independent reality that is observed. So from this point of view, the manas is that which constructs our experience into a self in a world within time and space. And then the third dimension, although they're usually enumerated the other way around, is awareness itself, the fundamental act of awareness. Of course, I'm recounting very, very simply what is a highly sophisticated and complex psychology and epistemology. But broadly, let's say that we can distinguish that aspect of mental functioning, not mind, I'm using the term mental functioning, in order to clarify that what we're talking about is a process rather than a static entity. So there's that aspect which is to do with the sensing of, well, sensory experience and its organization into a basic integral whole. And then that aspect which is to do with the abstraction from experience and its organization in terms of self and other, space and time, etc. Which is a pretty big achievement, actually, because animals, by and large, can only sense. They can't step aside from their experience and form a picture of what it is and how it works. So it's a huge evolutionary development. But from a Buddhist point of view, it's problematic if we don't understand what we're doing. And then, much more fundamentally, is simply the act of awareness itself. So let's distinguish between them. Let's say the mental processes, or mental, the intellectual processes, you might almost say, in an expanded sense of intellectual, and the fundamental act of awareness. So when we're talking about mind, we need to be clear what we're talking about. What we generally mean is some fuzzy sort of location within all that bundle. But these are all processes which are ever-changing and which are interacting with each other in a complex, conditioned manner.
So I'll just pick up two things from that. First, you were saying right at the start that Buddhism is not concerned with theory. I wonder whether one of the
sorry, I don't say it's not concerned with theory. I'm saying that its theory is always related to direct experience. Do you see what I mean? It's not concerned with providing a theory about the mind for its own sake. It's concerned only with talking about mind in order to help us to actually understand our direct experience.
I see. Yeah, no, that's better. I mean, because one of the things that many people I meet that don't know about Buddhism seem to think that Buddhism doesn't think very much. That it's really just to do, that it's just to do with being in the moment. It's a very common idea about Buddhism that it hasn't got a theory of mind or a theory of experience. It's really just to do with a practice and a being in the moment.
Well, but that clearly is a misunderstanding, perhaps based on the somewhat complex relationship that Buddhism does have to theory. It's not interested in theory for theory's sake. It's only interested in theory, to put it that way, in order to help us to understand. So Buddhism distinguishes between right view and wrong view, samyak and mithya drishti, drishti meaning vision, but here it means a view or perspective. And it distinguishes between those views that provide us with an understanding of reality that is mistaken, that leads us simply to perpetuate our self-attachment and therefore to suffer. Whereas a right view is not for its own sake. It's in order to help us to learn to relate to our experience in a way that is in conformity with reality. So it's only a mediate phenomenon. So the parable is given of the raft, famous parable of the raft, that you use a raft in order to cross the river, but once you've crossed the river, you don't carry the raft around with you. But you won't get to the other side unless you've got the raft. So you need a certain amount of ideas, a certain kind of a view, in order to really understand your experience correctly and free yourself from the mistaken views that lead to your suffering.
It might be worth just clarifying a bit more about what Buddhism means by view, because it can sound like a sort of conscious view, a conscious opinion.
Yeah.
And often people don't realise they have views.
Yeah. I would say almost always we don't realise what views we have. I'm not talking about people, I'm talking about me. You and me, my dear. It's so easy to talk about them, isn't it?
They're terrible.
Yes, we are unconscious of the assumptions we make about life. And of course, we're unconscious of them in a way that is quite popularly understood. We're not aware, for instance, famously at the moment, we're not aware as white people of the extent to which we are unaware of what it's like for people who are not white. So we just don't realize it because it's just the ground we tread on. So there's that sort of assumption we make in all sorts of discussion about this at present, the degree to which we're not aware of our own conditioning and its effect. But it goes much deeper than that. We're not aware of the extent to which we are carrying around with us an idea of a self which is quite unreal. We believe there's something about us that is fixed, eternal. Of course, if we say believe, everybody will say, oh, no, I don't. I know it's not like that. But it's something more instinctive, more bred in. In fact, in Buddhist theory, it's said that this is innate or connate. It's born with us, sahaja. So we're already conditioned to see things from the point of view of a fixed, independent self. So, yes, we're not aware of the extent to which our experience is pre-structured. It comes, to use a metaphor that could easily backfire on me. The mechanism comes with a program already set, and we're unaware that the operating system, I'm getting to the limits of my understanding here, the operating system is already preloaded. And a lot of what we're doing, a lot of our thinking is directed to us understanding the assumptions that we carry unconsciously or subconsciously within us, and that are bred into the very structure of our way of experiencing.
I mean, one example of that I was thinking about is how we so easily think we know about death, for instance. We have a belief about death, that when you die, that's it. Most people commonly, and those outside people watching this, rather than me, of course, but most people commonly, that you assume that death means the end.
I don't know whether that's true, but anyway, let's say they do.
Well, let's
I
say
don't
they
know.
do,
I really don't know. I just don't know anymore. Yeah.
But that might be an example of a view that appears to be a fact. I suppose what I'm getting at is that often enough, belief, to use that word, or view, actually is glossed as fact. Yeah. Just as belief in God was once conceived of as a fact, not a belief.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that?
I agree.
I mean, okay. I wasn't sure the more I talked about it.
Broadly speaking.
Broadly speaking, okay. So one of the ways to be really clear that view is a kind of, as you say, pre-setting. So going back to the other end of what you just said there, you made the distinction between the mind that sort of abstracts and creates a world, creates time and space, even creates a self and a world. And you made a distinction between that and awareness itself. I wonder whether you could say a bit more about that distinction and say a bit more about awareness itself, if it's possible to talk about that.
Well, it isn't in a way possible to talk about that because it's so foundational. It's not an object by definition, whereas even one's thoughts are objects. Do you see what I mean?
What do you mean by objects?
Well, they are objective to my awareness. They lie outside, as it were, to my awareness. So I can sit back and say, what am I thinking? I can say, what am I feeling? And I can make that an object of my attention. But the attention itself, I can't really make an object. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's a bit like, the eye cannot see itself because the seeing is entirely non-objective in the strict sense of objective. So the awareness itself is completely inaccessible to direct observation. It's possible to be aware in such a way that it's as if you are aware of being aware, but not in the sense of standing apart from your awareness and looking at it, but by gradually learning to be aware of the distinction between the awareness itself and its objects. You can be aware in such a way that it amounts to being aware of being aware. But it's not that you're aware of something objective. You can't be because of the entirely subjective character of awareness in the strict sense.
And is is the assumption that you're moving from one kind of consciousness or mind to awareness itself. What is the, I suppose what I'm asking is, what's the point for us, as it were? What's the value for us of this kind of exploration of mind?
The problem is that we are so unaware of our mental processes. We're unaware of the way in which experience arises. So we're completely, normally speaking, identified with the presentation of experience that we have, if you see what I mean. This, we just accept that it is reality, that it is independent, that I am somehow occupying it, and somehow, in a sense, independent of it, at the same time as occupying it and having it. So we just take all that for absolute granted. So our even the little bit of fine distinction that we've made today enables us to start sort of being more conscious of what's going on. So you can be more conscious of the way in which your senses construct a world. Because actually, we don't experience an independent world. What we experience is our mental construction, which presents itself as being the mental construction of something independent. But there's all sorts of common experiments that look at this. The famous one of putting prisms on people's eyes that turn the world upside down, and then after a while, once you become accustomed to it, you turn the world the right way up. And then when you take the glasses off, the world is the wrong way up. So in other words, we through these sort of practical experiments can experience directly, or rather we can notice directly the way in which we're constructing reality. And there's so many ways in which one can understand that. So you gradually begin to recognize that your senses are not delivering you literal reality. And you do this by becoming more and more mindful. That's the key term in all of this. The way in which we work is through mindfulness. So in mindfulness, you gradually separate out the act of being aware from the objects which you are aware of. In the Buddha's own terms, you unbundle it, you disentangle it, so that you learn that the physical world is not your awareness. It's something which you are aware of. And you gradually, therefore, become more and more, you get more and more in contact with awareness itself. You become aware of your thinking processes. You become aware of your emotions as processes, as conditioned processes, not as realities. You know what it's like when you get into a mood. The whole world is interpreted through your mood, because you've completely lost any kind of awareness of the mood as a mood. So the Buddha speaks of a famous sutta in which I think it's Shariputra says, there are 6 wonderful things about you, the Buddha, O Buddha. First of all, that you were born from your mother when she was standing up. This is a miracle. And you were born from her side, apparently miraculous. When you were born, you were born standing up and declared, this is my last rebirth, etc. So it goes on like that. And the Buddha said, yeah, that's all pretty miraculous, but it's not the real miracle. The real miracle is that when feelings arise in me, I know they're arising. When they remain, I know they're remaining. When they pass away, I know they're passing away. When thoughts arise, etc. So in other words, the Buddha is aware of these as conditioned processes. He's not caught up with them. He's not bound up with them. His awareness is unbundled from them. So when we're making these sort of distinctions, it helps us to focus our efforts to be mindful, so that we can gradually disentangle. Classically, we always start with awareness of the body, because the body is the most stable objective experience that we have, and it's far easier, therefore, to gradually be mindful of it without losing your place, as it were. If you're trying to be mindful of your thoughts, they rush so swiftly by that you're very easily caught up with them. But when you're, for instance, trying to be mindful of the breathing, you lose your mindfulness, but the breathing's still there. So back you come to it. So you gradually build up your capacity to be aware, independent of the processes of which you are aware.
I suppose, obviously I agree. I agree.
I'm relieved. I'm relieved.
Yeah, you knew I'd agree, and I agree. But one of the questions that it raises for me, and perhaps for others, is it can start to sound like a rather cool mindfulness, rather cool, almost philosophical, detaching matter. Where does heart, where does passion, where does the whole, because that sounds gorgeous if I imagine a sort of picture of a monk walking up and down in the forest, without a phone, without the mess of an ordinary human life. How can one imagine that kind of awareness in the mess of ordinary life, and which is quite often, as who was it who said, undisciplined squads of emotion? I think T.S. Eliot. Where does emotion and all of that? Does that have a place in mindfulness?
Well, what is the consequence of mindfulness? Let's say you're in a messy, ordinary situation, and you're able to be mindful. That is, not to allow yourself to get caught up in it. Somebody's behaving unpleasantly to you, and you're able to remain detached from it. So what is your feeling? Well, your feeling will be of ease, for a start. It probably will be of compassion. If you're sufficiently mindful, you'll be experiencing the other person not merely as unpleasantly angry or whatever, you'll experience them as suffering. Because you're becoming more deeply aware of what's going on, so that your deeper response will be one of love, of compassion, and in yourself of calm ease. And that calm ease isn't just going into a refrigerator, it's a delightful feeling. It's even ultimately blissful feeling, because you're completely uninvolved. So the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, in the mythic account of it, was assailed by Mara and his armies, and shooting arrows of anger and so forth at him, which just turned into flowers and it fell at his feet. So it's a beautiful image for something it's not just a calm automaton who's not responding, but somebody whose response is one of compassion and love, but detachment, ease, peace, at last. So yes, it's timely to raise that this process of disentanglement brings one into an experience of deeper and deeper joy and love. So it can even be said, and in some later traditions it is said, that the nature of mind is, really I think it should be said, the nature of awareness itself is love, joy, peace, etc. It's integral to awareness itself. If you are able to be aware in a sufficiently a vivid way, and to disentangle your awareness from the objects of awareness, your experience is going to be extraordinarily rich and loving, and you'll see the beauty in things. It's an aesthetic awareness, and you won't feel separate from everything, because you've given up that which separates, which is I, the sense of me as something stable and fixed and different. You've given that up, so that there's no sense of any separation from everything. You're to use a vastly overworked phrase, at one with everything, and you feel in harmony and peace with everything, even when it's chaotic. It's quite a tall order.
It's quite, because that word, you talk about uninvolved.
Yeah.
So often that can sound like you mean separate. It can sound, it means that one is slightly away from it. I mean, that's the fear that I hear, that people think about Buddhism or meditation or mindfulness.
Yeah. Well, interesting. I use the word involved or uninvolved because it's a word that is used to translate a word in one of the earliest Pali suttas, collections of suttas, called the Sutta Nipata. And the Buddha there speaks frequently about being uninvolved. But it means uninvolved in the sense of not being tangled up. So maybe it would be better to say disentangled. So that it's not alienation. Maybe that's what the fear would be. It's not an alienation from experience. In a sense, what we could argue is that our normal mode of experience is alienated because we are not seeing things as they are. We're giving unwise attention, ayoniso manaskara, to our experience. We're looking at it only from one point of view, in the light of a false construction. So we're actually alienated from reality ab initio, from the start.
I'm going to ask you what ab initio is.
So we're the alienation is what we start with. You know, the Buddha argues that all prathagjanas, or ordinary people, you and me, brother, are mad because we are confused. We don't understand things correctly. So being uninvolved means being uninvolved in the misinterpretation of our experience, being over-identified with that which we think is I and mine, that which we think will enhance me, or and against that which we think will harm me. So uninvolved, one has to interpret correctly. Disentangled, maybe. Yeah.
And I presume the other side is by getting entangled, we make things worse for ourselves and for other people.
Well, yes, and it's the entanglement that creates unskillful action. It's because we're entangled and therefore biased in our experience, in our approach to experience, that we harm self and other. We don't really know the way things are, and so we act in accordance with the way we think things are, which leads us to cause a lot of harm.
I want to sort of step a little bit further back just now, because everything you say sounds very sort of sensible.
Oh, thank you. Thank goodness for that. Yeah.
I think everything I say sounds sensible as well. Just a joke. I did a joke as well. I suppose one of the things it could sound like a kind of, I don't know, humanistic philosophy, quite a good one. You get tangled up in things. We need to untangle from things, don't we? We need to sort of own ourselves a bit.
Yeah.
We need to not cause harm by our... why do we have then for images of Buddhas? And is Buddhism a sort of ancient but kind of sort of humanistic psychology, philosophy?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, yes, it is humanistic. In the sense that it is human-centered. It's not about humanity's relationship to some esoteric reality, a God or whatever. It's based upon our own immediate direct experience, and everything it has to say emerges out of that, rather than about speculation. And the Buddha was strongly against speculation, which seems to have been rife in his own time. And he talked about the thicket of views, the tangle of views, the briar of views. So, yes, Buddhism is rigorously against that sort of speculative endeavor. So it's humanistic to that extent. It's based, within this 6-foot body, the Buddha says. It's everything that we can experience. It's not telling us to believe something that we cannot eventually experience. But the problem with humanism as it's generally understood is that it does not appreciate the extraordinary magnitude of what human being can achieve. I remember going to a humanist conference once, and I had to get out because I couldn't breathe. It was as if there was no vast sky Yes, there was no big, grey-bearded old man there, thank goodness. But there was no perspective, no larger perspective. It was just, let's be nice to each other until the lights go out, which is pretty dispiriting. I'd rather go rampant, frankly. But what Buddhism says is that, yes, it's human-centered, but if you really understand what this awareness is, you'll find that it leads to something of infinite magnitude that is of the highest possible fulfillment, and that reveals everything. So it's not just a question of coming to terms with life and living it as well as you can. Interestingly enough, that's what Nietzsche referred to in The Birth of Tragedy as European Buddhism. He thought that we were headed towards a European Buddhism. May we not be headed towards a European Buddhism in this sense. Let's have Brexit. A little joke. Yes, what he saw was that with the death of God, you just end up with a narrow humanism, precisely as you say. Yeah. But that is to terribly misunderstand Buddhism and to not recognize that what the Buddha is saying is, I have experienced total transcendence. I have experienced it directly. I have experienced, he says in words that are attributed to him immediately after enlightenment, that the mind has been deconditioned. In other words, it's been disentangled from conditions. Awareness has separated itself from the conditioned process. Conditioned processes take place in awareness, but awareness itself is larger, vaster. Although that is a dangerous way of talking, because it then sounds as if awareness is something in itself. But yes. So yes, that is the key point, that Buddhism is humanistic, but is humanism taken to its ultimate degree. And so in a way I welcome the humanistic developments in Western culture, but I think they need a much vaster perspective, which really can only come from people exploring their experience much more deeply and paying attention to those, the Buddha being the great exemplar, who have plumbed the depths of human possibility.
I wonder whether you could say a bit more about, because why would one practice Buddhism almost? Why
indeed, yes.
Because what we're doing in the Nature of Mind is exploring the mind from different perspectives, and what has Buddhism particularly got to offer that discussion? And as it were, what can I get out of it? I know that's not a very good way of going about a practice of anything, but it's inevitable in anyone. What am I, sell it to me, what am I going to get from it?
Well, no, I think it's a perfectly reasonable approach. What am I going to get from it? How are you going to motivate yourself in any other way? The only way would be to say, God tells me I ought to, or something of that kind. There has to be some, and even then, you're doing it for personal reasons, because you want God on your side. So Buddhism begins with suffering. That was supposedly the first discourse of the Buddha. Was concerned with the Four Noble Truths: the truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, freedom from suffering, and the path to freedom from suffering. So we're interested in practicing the Dhamma because we experience dissatisfaction, not just at the superficial level of not always getting what we want, but at a more deep level, at the level of not feeling that life is fulfilling as we normally live it. And also that we see how much suffering there's around us, and how much of that suffering is not merely to do with human beings in humanity to each other, but also to do with where that comes from in people. So there's a fundamental problem for any intelligent, thinking, sensitive person of suffering and happiness. if you're at all awake, you'll want to know, how do you live a good life that will be fulfilling and satisfying and will make other people happy? So it seems to me it's a completely immediate, practical, personal question. That's why I began, because I was dissatisfied. Yes, partly in a psychological sense, but partly in a more profound sense. I couldn't see the point of it all. What was the point? And it's very, very striking at the moment, of course. There's this huge wave of mental illness, particularly amongst young people, because it's just pointless. What do you do? What do you lie for? Turn on your mobile phone, contact people through social media, no direct contact. It's a simulacrum of human communication. It's got its value, but it's limited, etc. So life is pretty damn pointless. And a lot of people are deciding it's pointless and ending it. So I think this is a problem that most people face, but what we manage to do is to stay one step ahead of the game. So we think, if I do this, then. If I do this, then. If I do this, then. But it doesn't work. You're always running just ahead of the breath of death on your back, and the breath of suffering on your back. So, what Buddhism invites us to do, and which many of us feel a desperate need for, is to stop and say, okay, how do we resolve this question of suffering? How do we find real, deep fulfillment? We may be happy. We may have a lot of pleasure in our lives, but more fundamentally, we feel, I think unfulfillment is the best word to me. I remember that so strongly as a young man. Just particularly in the middle of the night. There's a lovely passage in Nietzsche, Schopenhauer's Educator. What young person does not wake up in the middle of the night and ask, why? Why am I all here? Why am I here? And you can do that because the treadmill has not begun. You're not caught up in it all. So it's relevant to us to explore our experience, which means ultimately exploring our minds in all those three dimensions that I've spoken of, and gradually disentangling our awareness so that it's not just caught up in the terrible sort of compulsion of life, which can be okay. For most of us, it's actually all right. But still, underneath it all, there's a deeper sense of dissatisfaction. The Dhamma speaks of three levels of suffering. There's immediate, actual suffering. Then there's the suffering that comes because we're not getting what we want, and we get what we don't want. But then there's a deeper suffering. It's just because it doesn't all add up. And if you look, it doesn't add up. So we're exploring not in order to provide a theory. Neuroscientists may do that in order to help people with neurological problems. That's very, very important. That's not our immediate purpose. Something we can support and applaud, and may even find insights that are helpful for our own explorations. But our explorations are not to do with coming up with the right theory about things. They're about understanding how to work with our own minds in this broadest sense, so that we eventually disentangle our mindfulness from its objects and become, therefore, liberated.
So elsewhere you've talked about that you need a kind of positive dissatisfaction, really, don't you? You need some kind of sense that the life that you're presented with, a career, family, and so on, that's just, you need some kind of positive dissatisfaction, it seems to me.
Yes, I think that it's very important that this is disentangled from, for instance, depression, which is clearly a common phenomenon and a real phenomenon and a real problem. But often, actually, what people are experiencing is something more fundamental. And I think that we have to place a value on that. Buddhism, interestingly, thinks of dukkha as something positive, because it's a spur to change. If everything was okay, why change? If life was entirely satisfactory, why would we bother to work with it? But because it's not, and because its dissatisfactions pinch us from time to time on one level or another, that we become motivated to grow and to cause therefore less harm to ourselves and others, and ultimately to be liberated. So I think that it's important to learn to love your dissatisfaction in this deepest sense. Of course, if you're seriously depressed and so forth, then you need a certain kind of help. But many people feel a deeper sense of dissatisfaction, which they either attribute to mere depression. I don't mean mere, but attribute to depression in the more immediate sense, or they just try to cover over. But that deeper sense of life is not really worth it as I'm living it now, as it's presented to me. Now, what is worthwhile? That is, I think, something greatly to be encouraged.
Yeah, indeed. I want to perhaps take another step now, which is to try and explore a little bit of some of the views that you see around, or the ideas around of what Buddhism is. I can sort of think of three that come to my mind as we're talking. So one is the assumption that Buddhism is really a kind of well-being practice, that it's it's talked a lot about in terms of stress, in terms of managing stress and so on. Can you say something about Buddhism and well-being?
Well, of course, Buddhism is about well-being. It must be, but it places a very high value on well-being. If you see what I mean, it's a bit like what I said about humanism. It's okay as far as it goes. It just doesn't go far enough. So where does your well-being really lie? Your well-being lies ultimately in liberating your awareness, and that is where you'll experience real well-being. The Buddha says, Nibbanang paramang sukhang. Nibbana, which means the liberation of awareness, it's a paraphrase, not what it literally means, is the highest happiness, the highest bliss. So if you're really interested in well-being, well, you will aim to liberate your mind. But what so often people mean is adjustment, mere adjustment to reality. But if you're at all sensitive, a false reality is not adjustable to. It can't be done. You can achieve temporary stasis. You can come to peace with it, as it were, but it cannot be stable by definition. And so we're not merely talking about adjustment to reality. And I think there's a problem. Some very good things are being taken from Buddhism, but they're being used merely for adjustment. And I think a lot of the talk of mindfulness is clearly about adjustment in that way. It's a good thing, and I hope it will lead to something more. But it's not ultimately what Buddhism is about. It's about something far more than that. So yes, Buddhism is a well-being teaching, but it's a well-being teaching to its ultimate degree. If you understand well-being deeply enough, then you've got the Dhamma. Number one problem. What were the other two?
I thought number 2 and 3 are a bit more metaphysical. Well, I don't know. I might be making this up, but let's see. So the other, view that you're hearing more nowadays about Buddhism is that it's about non-self. That self is the construct. It's interesting. I grew up. I was at art school when I first got involved in Buddhism, and everyone used to talk about Foucault and Derrida. And we were all going around deconstructing our experience, deconstructing value, deconstructing meaning, and discovering that none of those things meant anything or were of any value. And looking back on it, I think that was very destructive. I don't know whether anyone actually read Foucault, but that's what came from it. A view I'm seeing more is that Buddhism is a kind of deconstruction of oneself, that you're seeing the parts that are entangled, you kind of deconstruct them and see there isn't a self here at all.
Well, in a sense, that is true. However, it's important to stress what is revealed when you do that, if you see what I mean. So I think it's probably as important, if not more so, to stress the positive, as I say, revelation as you gradually disentangle yourself, in my language of earlier. So I think that given the strong tendency towards conceptualization and abstraction of our modern culture, which is, of course, accelerating because of the development of technology and the evolution of connections between people through abstract media, and even the development of virtual reality. All of that means that we're occupying increasingly an abstracted realm and going further and further away from our immediate experience. You know, the classic thing, you see people walking along the road talking to themselves, and you realize they're not actually walking along the road, they're in a conversation with a friend who's not there. So this, I'm not saying it's always a bad thing, but it's a little bit of an indicator of the trend of our culture. So I suspect that whilst deconstruction is necessary, it's a necessary part of Buddhist practice, that one recognizes that these certitudes that we have bred into us are entirely constructed. It's even more important for most of us to develop much stronger, positive spiritual experience, or even human experience, like metta, like love, and like contentment and joy and gratitude. It's even more important that we develop those aspects of things. And I think that this deconstruction without these positive human and spiritual experiences simply leads to nihilism. Whereas, of course, the development of those qualities without deconstruction leads to eternalism. In other words, the belief in something absolute and ultimate. So Buddhism is a middle way between those two. So we're developing both a clear understanding of the nature of our experience, which is different from what we assume it to be, and we're developing positive, emotional, human, and increasingly transhuman experience. And that, I think, in the modern circumstance, is even more important because of the highly abstracted nature of most people's construction of the world. That people live in highly abstract dimensions. And so I think basic mindfulness, emotional positivity, the development of fundamental human and a little bit beyond human experience is more important for most people than the deconstruction. And to launch poor art students who are half mad already into that realm of deconstruction is cruelty to dumb animals. I'm only teasing him, art students, don't worry. I remember him when he came along.
It was a bit dumb.
No, it's just idiocy, because it sounds so good. But without the background of highly positive experience, it's dangerous. So Buddhism traditionally talks of development of understanding in terms of two different phases. What's called shamatha, which means calmness or tranquility, integration, and emotional positivity, making subtle of one's experience, and vipassana, which means insight, which means deconstruction, in a certain sense, you could say. But these two are said to be necessary together. And classically, it's not always the case, but classically you develop shamatha before you develop vipassana. You develop a really good, basic human, healthy awareness, what Sangharakshita called happy, healthy human. So you're just an ordinary, decent, good human being. And you're in contact with yourself, with your bodily experience. You're in contact with actual other human beings who you're communicating with directly, not mediately. And then you can begin to deconstruct. But I can guarantee that if you deconstruct before you develop that basic positivity, you will find depression staring you in the face. Fortunately, most people are too healthy to go there, but or many people. But you know what I mean. But self-protective maybe rather than healthy. But yes, it's very, very important, and I think in our modern culture that the positive sides of Buddhism need to be much more strongly stressed. And Buddhism as simply a method for deconstruction is a false trail.
Before I say this other area that I wanted to explore, can you say a little bit more about, you mentioned sort of a bit beyond human, or transhuman.
Yeah.
So that starts to edge us into,
Yeah.
hang on, what's that there? I thought we were in the 6 foot.
Yeah.
I'm 5'11" myself, anyway, I see what he means.
Yeah. Oh, I thought we'd just pass over that quickly. Well, what I mean is experience which begins to touch on what is not based on I. So that when you practice meditation, to begin with, it's a lot to do with just integrating yourself and basic human healthy state of mind. But you will begin to experience something that's a little bit more elevated, a superhuman rather, rather than transhuman maybe at this point. So you begin to experience something's not exactly transcendental, in other words, completely beyond self-identity, but something that is an attenuated selfhood, where the self and other are in a much more fluid interrelationship with each other. You know, the comparison's often made with aesthetic experience, when you really deeply engage with a meaningful piece of art, in the old-fashioned sense, then you go a little bit beyond yourself. You can actually sense that sometimes when you're looking at a wonderful painting.
I remember you talking about looking at Van Gogh's shoes, the painting of his
boots. Yeah. Well, I remember especially in Singapore, seeing a painting by Pissarro of a Normandy harbour. And I was completely, I was just going there because I'd been taken there. Why I'd come to Singapore to see Impressionist art, I don't know. But I was just suddenly taken by, the scruff of my neck and pulled into the painting and experienced something sort of letting go of self to a small degree. So that's what I'm sort of talking about, that kind of experience. Music is very common for that, isn't it? I don't mean even just, it can be really good, more popular music. It can somehow just pull you up. I won't mention Jimi Hendrix at this point, but
So another question, then, that you were saying that that you start off with this healthy, happy human, and for many people that's already quite a project.
Yes, indeed it is. I'm still working on it.
I'll get there. One of the questions that can arise for some people, I think, is that Buddhism could just become about that. That it's progressive, that it's a path of development, very much like any other path of development, like doing yoga, like improving your diet, like I don't know, listen to YouTube clips about how to interact with people better. And where I got that from? I'm sure there are such clips. Sorry, I'm distracted myself.
You did.
I did completely. So sometimes when people think, actually, no, Buddhism, there's some trains of thought that say, no, Buddhism is about non-dual awareness. That let's not, Buddhism really isn't about growing and maturing as a person, because that's small fry.
Small fry.
Or they might even not think of it quite like that, but they might think, when you see more and more people talking in terms of non-dual awareness or non-duality or an experience of mind only.
I tend to reach for my Luger at this point. These are big words that people bandy around and they shouldn't be allowed to. It should be against the law. I mean that. You know what I mean? These are big terms. Wash your mouth out when you utter the word non-duality. It's not a term to be used in a quasi-metaphysical sense. I think it's dangerous, that sort of language. But anyway, yes. Your general point is that, isn't that what Buddhism really is, rather
yes,
than
and
this?
isn't that what Buddhism really is? And
Yeah.
or is it really just a growth practice? You know, a valuable, careful philosophical growth practice. I suppose that's the dichotomy I'm trying to draw.
Well, I don't see them as mutually exclusive.
Right.
So I would say that the project of becoming, let's use the slogan, happy, healthy human, is an absolutely basic one for human beings and for anybody practicing Buddhism. And frankly, I'd be really pleased if people did that and stopped there. I'd be so pleased, because it's better to be a happy, healthy human being than an unhappy, unhealthy, not quite human being. So I'd be very, very happy if people achieved that. But we're, from a committed Buddhist point of view, we're doing that as part of a process of going beyond that. But you can't go beyond that unless you've achieved that. And I think, but this has been spoken of as spiritual bypass, this phenomenon that people try to go right to the non-dual, that's a giveaway automatically, before they've actually achieved this sort of normal humanity. And so that there's Bante always used to quote Nietzsche that our love for others is often our bad love for ourselves. So I think often our interest in non-duality is our insufficiency as ordinary human beings. And it's a giveaway because you're using an abstract metaphysical term, which may have some content for you, of course, I don't want to deny that, but which as soon as it's translated into a term, falsifies itself. So I think that it'd be far better if people put much more attention on basic humanity, and as a means of going beyond that. And very often, I've experienced it myself. I think I made, in a certain sense, a certain amount of progress in my spiritual life for a number of years. Then I had to go back and fill in the gaps, things I'd not dealt with earlier on. Basic stuff to do with relations with parents and all that sort of thing. It needed to be sorted out. It doesn't mean that everything I did before that was a mistake. It just, in order to go further, I had to complete the earlier stages. Sangharakshita talks of the path of regular steps. You can't go right to the top of stairs, if you see what I mean, if the bottom stairs are shaky, because the whole edifice collapses. So you have to go back down and firm up what's earlier on. So I think a lot of emphasis for most of the people who come through our door is going to be on basic human health and positivity and decent human relations, learning to communicate properly. Just learning to live properly. It doesn't mean that you're not actually working in other ways. You can be doing vipassana practices and so forth, but you won't get very far with that. You may have blinding insights at times, but you will not be able to stabilize them because they won't have any foundation. It's a bit like building a pinnacle on a very, very thin tower. It eventually falls over, so you need to build it a pyramid gradually. So I think this is a big issue. So Buddhism, I believe, does both. It works on well-being, humanity. I wish we'd do more of that. I wish people would concentrate more on that. And its aim is ultimately the liberation of awareness. But you cannot liberate awareness if you're still caught up in these conditioned tangles which obscure your awareness, so that your bad relations with your mum, to speak topically, then stand in the way of all your relationships and affect your relation to life. So you need to sort of do, at some point, it may not be a big deal, it may not mean therapy or anything like that. You just have to think, hey, wait a minute, I'm behaving like that because of this. And you sort of disentangle it. That should happen in the process of development. But you're doing it as a committed Buddhist in order to go far beyond that.
So I'll just say a little bit more about metaphysics, and then we'll go back down, to the practical. But is there anything in this language of non-duality? Is there any, it is. I don't actually know what it means really. It's one of those.
I should hope not.
Just sort of, it sounds gorgeous, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's the main thing. Is there anything in it? What is something being got at?
Of course. It's just that one has to be careful how one uses it. So obviously, what's been spoken of is the experience that you have when you disentangle manas, this abstracting, constructing function of mind, which creates a world of self and other. When you see through that, doesn't mean it stops, but you've seen through it. So it's going on because it's a conditioned process, but your awareness is larger than that. So in that sense, your awareness is non-dual, because awareness itself does not, as it were, have that duality built into it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
The duality is added on to it. It's adventitious. The awareness itself is not bifurcated. Awareness in each moment emerges first whole and integral, but it's then constructed by the other aspects of mental functioning into a world with an I who's perceiving it. So yes, what we're indicating by non-duality is not a thing, as it were, but it's really more like non-dualizing, if you see what I mean. Always beware of substantives in Buddhism. In philosophy, actually. Whenever somebody uses substantive, that is a noun or a noun phrase, reach for your lawyer. Because they're translating process into thing. So when people speak of non-duality or the non-dual, the transcendental, they have a content, but they have a content that should be only used once in a lifetime, if you see what I mean. But when they become the coinage of your discourse, they've already lost their meaning, if you see what I mean. So that Buddhism is rigorously cautious about metaphysics. It should be. So Shunyata Theory, for instance, the theory that ultimately everything is free from fixed nature, a fixed identity, is fundamental. So that if one uses a word like non-dual, shunyata. If you use the word shunyata, think shunyata, because people sometimes bandy the word shunyata, which literally means emptiness. It gets translated into an abstract metaphysical entity, which then needs deconstructing. So that's why I was ridiculing the notion. Of course it has a content, but its content is situational. Do you see what I mean? There's a time to speak of it and there's a time not to speak of it. And whenever you use these sort of terms outside their initial context, you falsify them. They're more like poetic terms. I've noticed this with this term suprapersonal force that I popularized, picking up something that Sangharakshita had written to me. And then I hear people saying, "Oh, I felt the suprapersonal force last night." And you think, "Oh my God," because they're abstracting it and turning it into a thing. But it's a sort of term that you use because it's the best way you can describe your experience. So always one should stick as close, as Sangharakshita says, to the raw experience and speak from that. So if your experience was that there was, you could see I there, a conditioned process. You could see, non-I. You could see that as a conditioned process, but you, so to speak, didn't feel involved with all that. Then maybe you've got a license to say something about non-duality, but maybe best to just describe the experience. And I think we're in danger, because we have the whole of the Buddhist tradition available to us, we're in danger of taking off-the-shelf metaphysical concepts and applying them shallowly to our own relatively shallow experience.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good. So I want to come away now from those. I'm way out of my depths. I want to come away from those.
Well, I should hope so too.
Those sort of thoughts, and come back to what I hope might be the viewer, which I'm imagining someone. I'm imagining someone watching this that's new to Buddhism. Perhaps more and more people have done Headspace. More and more people have.
Sorry.
Headspace is where they do some meditation app, I think.
Good heavens.
More and more people have. When I teach at the London Buddhist Centre, I know more and more people have done some meditation. Online using apps and so on.
Good.
That's becoming much bigger, and there's much more people come to Buddhism having studied it even at school and so on, which when I first got involved was unheard of. So for the newer person looking, a bit interested in Buddhism perhaps, but also I hope very much interested in the nature of mind, what should they do? What would you say to them? I don't know. Let's say a young 25-year-old man or woman or whoever. Bit messed up in their life. Things are a bit tricky, as they so often are at that age.
Sure.
Buddhism helped me somehow,
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing for most people is community. I think that most people need community because that is sadly under attack in modern times, and I think especially in this last period of lockdown. People have felt very cut off. And so what I would strongly recommend is that you find a spiritual community. You find people who share your concerns and involve yourself with them. Recognize they're not going to be perfect. I speak from personal experience. But involve yourself with an active spiritual community. That is, people who are definitely trying to explore experience. And definitely trying to enlarge their experience and have some sort of teaching that is very open and that is not dogmatic and is not, as it were, metaphysically prescriptive in all the senses I've been diatribing against, if you can diatribe, and engage yourself, because I think that the primary route to becoming a happy, healthy human being is engaging with a healthy community. And all those communities that you're going to engage with will, to begin with, be not entirely happy, healthy communities, but engage with those communities that share your values, that share your concerns, and where you feel some affinity with people, and where you are able to work together to discover your own experience more fully and to unpack your own experience. So I think that's absolutely primary. I'd say almost before meditation. But meditation's going to be a route that people take for that. So if that's your interest, find other people who are meditating, who do associate with each other and see themselves as having some sort of commitment as a community, not against others. That's a negative phenomenon, but a group of people, a community of people who are striving to explore experience and find out, to use your title, the nature of mind. Not one I'm particularly comfortable with because of its loaded nature. But I think that's absolutely primary. Don't think in terms of going off and doing it by yourself, unless you're a thoroughly exceptional individual, and I'll dare to say, audience, you are not thoroughly exceptional individuals. If you are an exceptional individual, you won't take exception to what I'm saying. But the majority of people are not exceptional, and most of us in the modern world are actually living a rather peculiar kind of awareness. I don't think we realize how odd our particular construction of awareness is. I spend a lot of time in India, and although India is going the way of the rest of the world very rapidly, still I experience a more traditional human being who is less of a bifurcation between the thinking and feeling, more whole, more integrated into a family, more integrated into a community. So I sort of hover between a traditional society and a radically post-traditional society. And I become aware, of course, therefore, of the extent to which I myself suffered from the gradual decay of traditional society, which my generation actually did it. We're the ones who are responsible for your agonies, because we broke with the traditional society that we'd been brought up with. It's not a good state. It's not a healthy state. And so I think that people need to get themselves into a normal human state, like human beings all over the world have been for countless generations. And then from there, you can explore much more deeply.
I wonder whether it might, because a lot of people probably feel they are in a community. They've got, there's more and more sort of style tribes. You
Yes.
can, I don't know, if you're into progressive rock, you can follow that. If you're into, I don't know. Anyway, you get style tribes that, and there seems to be a development in which style tribes are becoming more theory-based and more even ideological. Don't know whether that's true, but what I'm noticing is sort of more and more sort of groups of people who identify very strongly with each other, and disidentify with others, or even against each other. What's the difference between that and what you're calling a spiritual community?
Yes. Well, I think it is a phenomenon that as people feel more and more deracinated and lacking in a community to identify with, they're constructing communities on relatively superficial bases, which can be, even gender identity, etc. Relatively superficial, if you see what I mean. And one can quite understand and sympathize with that, because it is difficult to be different. But what a spiritual community is people who are coming together because they are human beings who want to grow as human beings to become something more than human. And so you're coming together in something far more fundamental. And your more superficial identities, relatively superficial identities, become less important. So, for instance, I come from a certain class and background. You come from a certain class and background. You have a certain orientation. We won't say what it is. It's different from
any guesses?
It's different from mine. Any guesses? But what we share with each other is far more fundamental than those relatively superficial differences. And that is the wonder of a genuine spiritual community, that it draws us together on the basis of our humanity and of our ultimate transhumanity. So, for instance, I work in India. People there come from a totally different background to mine. Literally, in social terms, they come from the poorest and most deprived sections of society, at least their ancestors did. It's a very different culture. And their economic status is very different to mine. Their education is very different to mine. But they're my brothers and sisters. And some of them my teachers. Because we share a common humanity and a common commitment to going beyond that humanity, to use that phrase. So that's the hallmark of a spiritual community, that it can contain an increasing variety of different style groups, if you see what I mean. And the danger, of course, is that style tribes tend to then appropriate spiritual community, which, of course, is then the death of spiritual community, although one can understand why there's a debate about that. But yes, ultimately, a successful spiritual community is where you come together as human beings, and human beings who share a common aim or goal.
Yeah, indeed. And so let's say, we'll start rounding up now, I think, but let's say that this person has, found a community that you described. Then what do they do?
Well, if it's an ideal or a positive spiritual community, and of course one has in mind one's own, one will be first engaging in spiritual friendship. In other words, you'll be relating to other people on a completely new basis. I remember that very clearly in my own first retreat, relating to others on that retreat, and experiencing complete difference to my normal friendships. And I didn't even realize I was doing it till I got back. I've got very good friends, but I realized there's a quality to the connections that I had with people on that retreat who were newcomers like me that was quite different to my normal experience of friendship. And so yes, you'll be engaging in spiritual friendship. You'll be learning to apply techniques of human growth, methods of human development, principally meditation. You'll be learning to work on your emotions, partly through those meditation practices, partly through devotional practices, which are imaginative, poetic endeavors in which you cultivate and refine your emotional life. Hopefully, you'll begin to work with others so that you increasingly find your everyday life is engaged in this enterprise. If you can, you'll live with others in a community. If you're so privileged to be free to do that, so you can engage with all the practices, all the opportunities that gives you to develop yourself in a very positive environment. It won't always be positive, and it's partly working with when it's not always positive that is the way you grow. It's a nice excuse, but yes, you engage and work on whatever the community offers you, and it will offer you also study of what's involved in this process. You'll study the nature of mind talks and so forth that are being given in this series. You'll be following up teachings about meditation. You'll be following up teachings about how growth happens. About the positive processes of conditionality that can lead you, out of the mess, and so on. So that community will be sustained by the practice of its members and will draw new members into that practice.
And yet, let's get to a final question, because there's so much even in that I could ask you more about. But I suppose it would be nice to finish a bit personally. Next year you'll have been ordained for 50 years. You've committed your life to the practice of Buddhism within the Sri Ratna Buddhist community. And it's a trivial question, but what have you got from it? We just looked at, some 25-year-old or whatever, thinking, what am I going to get from it? What have you got from it?
Well, it's certainly not money.
No,
or fame.
We even bought you the jacket.
You did buy me the jacket, yeah. But, and certainly not fame, or only a very limited fame in a very small pond. But it's satisfaction, fulfillment, and a deepening happiness and contentment. And I can dare to say that I'm generally pretty happy these days, which I certainly haven't always been. And I'm generally better behaved than I've been. Doesn't mean perfect, but I'm generally better behaved and more easy to work with and so on. So yes, it's been a fulfilling life. But more than anything, I have very, very good friendships. Friends who I've known, ever since I became involved, and friends I picked up along the way, like your good self, and friends who I have absolute confidence in my friendship with them, and who, even though I don't always see them, I know that immediately I see them, we'll be on track again. We're not on track again, that we've always been on track. Like you and I don't meet that often, but when we meet, our communication is instant. That's what I like to say. You can say what you like later. But, I think that is one of the greatest gifts that the Dhamma life has given me, and involvement with the spiritual community has given me. I did a solitary retreat recently. We're encouraged to spend time completely on our own from time to time. A long time ago did 8 months on my own, and recently I did 3 months. And during that time I found I was not alone. All my friends were there with me, very silently, fortunately, keeping themselves to themselves, as it were. But I felt their presence all around me, and I felt my a deep connection with them. And the thought came to me, this is what life is about. It's about friendship, about this quality of friendship, of sharing so deeply with so many people at a level where which almost goes beyond us as separate individuals, and that where I feel I carry them all in my heart, in my mind, because we're talking about mind, in my mind all the time. And it's an odd experience for me. Sometimes people say, "Oh, I haven't seen you for a long time. I haven't heard from you," and I think, for me, I've been in contact with them all the time. But sometimes people need the reassurance of a message every now and again. But yes, I think that to me is what's made it really worthwhile. That I've had a very large pool of people from a very wide range of backgrounds. I feel a deep attunement with. And I've had a teacher, probably the greatest gift a human being can have. A teacher who, whilst I found him problematic in certain ways, and we have to always say, from another point of view, I saw him as touching the starry heights, and I'm deeply grateful to him for linking me to the spiritual life and to this network of friendships, which I hope that our viewers, whoever they are going to be able to move into for themselves, because it is what life is all about, really.
That's wonderful. That's a great place to finish. Thank you very much, Subhuti. Thank you. Yeah, so I hope that I hope you'll listen to the other interviews that we'll be doing. There's a whole range of interviews we'll be doing for the nature of mind. But not just, the idea of nature of mind is not just to listen to valuable conversations, but to explore them with seminars, interactive seminars, and then apply what we've learned, some of the things that we've learned just watching this today, apply it in our actual meditation, learn meditation. And then hopefully you can come on retreat with us here at Adhisthana. But yes, thank you very much.
I should say, that's one thing I would recommend to anybody who wants to engage. Go on a retreat, because on the retreat, like I did, you experience that community in a way that is very difficult if you're just going to a centre. So if I might put in that word,
yes,
I think that's very, very important. I should have said it earlier, but it's very, very important to actually taste what it's like to be part of a spiritual community. And I can pretty much guarantee that you will experience that.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.